There's a moment in every human life when the world splits in two. When something that once felt simple becomes impossibly complicated. When you suddenly see yourself through eyes that weren't there before. For Adam and Eve, that moment wasn't just personal. It was the birth of human consciousness as we know it. The first time shame walked into the garden. Picture a place where every sensation is direct and uncomplicated. The Garden of Eden wasn't just a location, it was a psychological state. A realm where desire and fulfillment existed without the torturous gap we now call longing. Where hunger meant eating, not craving. Where nakedness meant presence, not vulnerability. Adam and Eve moved through this space without the weight of self-observation. They existed, but they didn't yet watch themselves existing. And that difference is everything. God places one boundary in this boundless world. A single tree among thousands. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from it, or you will die. In ancient Near Eastern culture, knowledge wasn't just information. It was intimate, experiential understanding. To know good and evil meant to internalize the crushing weight of moral awareness. To carry the burden of discernment that separates innocence from experience. But here's what most people miss. The prohibition itself introduces something that didn't exist before. The concept of limitation. The idea that desire can exist without fulfillment. For the first time, there's something present that must remain untouched. And with that, a new psychological space opens. The space between what is and what could be. The garden of possibility has just been planted inside the human mind. Then the serpent arrives. Not with force, but with a question. The text in Genesis describes the serpent as more crafty than any other creature. That Hebrew word, arum, suggests shrewdness and cunning. But what makes the serpent's approach so psychologically devastating isn't deception. It's something far more subtle. The serpent doesn't lie to Eve. It reframes. It takes God's clear instruction and wraps it in ambiguity. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Notice the strategy here. The serpent doesn't attack God directly. It attacks Eve's certainty about what God said. It introduces the possibility that she might have misunderstood, that perhaps there's another interpretation she hasn't considered. This is the birth of self-doubt. Not the healthy questioning that leads to growth, but the corrosive uncertainty that makes you distrust your own perception of reality. Eve responds by clarifying. She knows what God said. But something has already shifted. By engaging with the serpent's question, she's entered a new mental territory. She's defending a position she never had to defend before. And in that defense, the seed of doubt has already been planted. The serpent continues, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Here's where the psychology becomes razor sharp. The serpent doesn't deny God's authority. It reinterprets God's motivation. It suggests that the prohibition isn't protection, but control, that God is withholding something desirable not for their sake, but for His. This reframing transforms everything. Suddenly, obedience looks like limitation. Trust looks like naivety. And the boundary that once protected them now appears as a wall keeping them from something they deserve. But there's something else happening beneath the surface. Something we need to pay attention to. The serpent tells Eve she will become like God. But what does that actually mean to someone who has never felt unlike God? Someone who has lived in perfect communion with the divine? The promise only makes sense if Eve has already begun to feel separate. If some gap has opened between her experience and God's presence. The serpent isn't creating desire from nothing. It's naming something that has already begun to stir. Eve looks at the tree. The text tells us she saw that it was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. This is the moment of internal collapse. 3 different lenses of perception stack on top of each other: physical hunger, aesthetic pleasure, intellectual ambition. For the first time, desire is no longer simple. It's layered, complex, justified. She's not just hungry. She's reasoning about her hunger, validating it, building a case for it. This is what makes the moment so recognizable across every human life. We've all been there, in that space where we know what we should do, but we're constructing elaborate justifications for why the thing we want is actually the thing we need. And if you're finding yourself drawn into these psychological depths, into the hidden mechanics of how we became who we are, consider subscribing to this channel. We're exploring the inner worlds of biblical figures, not as religious lessons, but as mirrors of the human psyche. It's a journey through the most ancient stories in search of the most current truths about ourselves. Eve takes the fruit and eats. Then she gives it to Adam, who is with her, and he eats too. Notice that detail. Adam is present during this entire exchange. He hears the serpent's words. He watches Eve's deliberation. He says nothing. His silence is its own kind of participation. Perhaps it's easier to let someone else make the forbidden choice first, to let them test the waters, to maintain a thin veil of innocence while benefiting from their transgression. This is human moral psychology at its most uncomfortable. We're capable of complex self-deception, of being simultaneously complicit and distant, of wanting the outcome without owning the action. Then comes the moment the entire narrative has been building toward. Their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. The knowledge comes crashing in, but it's not knowledge of good and evil in some abstract sense. It's knowledge of themselves. They see their own bodies with new eyes. Eyes that judge, that compare, that find lacking. This is the birth of self-consciousness, the emergence of the observing self that stands apart from experience and evaluates it. And with that comes shame. Not guilt over what they've done, but shame about what they are. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. This is the first psychological shift, the fractured self, the voice inside that watches and criticizes and finds you fundamentally deficient. They sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. This is humanity's first attempt at self-protection, at hiding not from God, but from each other, from their own gaze. The covering isn't practical, it's symbolic. It's the beginning of every mask we wear, every persona we construct, every carefully curated version of ourselves we present to the world because we believe the truth of who we are is too much, too naked, too shameful to be seen. When God walks in the garden, they hide, not because God has changed, but because they have. The divine presence that once felt like home now feels like exposure, like a spotlight on everything they wish wasn't true. This is the legacy we inherit, this learned impulse to hide when we most need connection, to cover when we most need to be seen, to construct walls precisely where bridges would heal us. The psychological machinery set in motion in Genesis chapter 3 still runs in every human mind. The voice that questions whether you understood correctly, that reframes boundaries as limitations, that promises you'll finally be enough if you just acquire one more thing, achieve one more goal, become one more version of yourself. The inner critic that watches you with eyes that never rest. The shame that makes you believe your truest self is your worst self. The impulse to hide your reality behind carefully constructed appearances. Adam and Eve's story isn't about a distant garden or a literal fruit. It's about the moment humanity became human in the way we now understand that word. Conscious, self-aware, burdened by knowledge, split between who we are and who we think we should be, living in the gap between desire and fulfillment, between innocence and experience, between the self we show and the self we hide. The first psychological shift was a fracture, and we've been trying to become whole ever since.